In the early days of the United States, pirates based in North Africa began to seize American ships and their crews. To prevent this, or at the very least get their crews returned, so they'd not be sold into slavery, the United States began to secure peace treaties with the territories known collectively at the time as the Barbary States, and provided numerous payments for ransoms and other sorts of tribute in an attempt to prevent further piracy. All the same, this burden was putting a large financial drain on the new nation at a time when a $1 million ransom was a large fraction of the federal budget. And in 1801, the United States had had enough and chose a different option, and thus began the First Barbary War. The war kicked off specifically when Thomas Jefferson, newly sworn into office, got a demand for $225,000 from the Pasha of Tripoli. And he was like, nope. The Pasha declared war and the fight began. Of course, the custom of declaring war in North Africa at the time didn't involve a formal letter of or document or any sort of traditional Western sort of means, but a cutting down the flagpole at the country's consulate. A little strange, but easy to miss if you're not up to speed on how the locals communicate. Remember, folks, not everyone is about official letterhead. But Jefferson had been prepared for the fight, as had the United States, having built a small navy that set off to protect U.S. ships. The U.S. was joined by some Swedish ships, as Sweden was already in a bit of scuffle with Tripoli since 1800, and things got going. There was some working with the King of Naples while he was also busy fighting Napoleon. A ship named Enterprise plots to overthrow the Pasha and replace him with his brother, and a group of 8 U.S. Marines who found themselves leading 500 mercenaries from North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean to capture the city of Derna in Tripoli. This kind of inspired a song about the shores of Tripoli. You may have heard about it. It was also the first time that the U.S. flag was raised up after a military victory overseas. But with the U.S. Army on their doorstep, the Pasha of Tripoli, Yusuf Karamanli, decided, maybe this whole war thing isn't going so well, so hey guys, peace, up for that? The treaty would have had the captured Americans returned, but also the captured Tripolitanians. Or Tripolitanians? I don't know how to pronounce that properly. But Yusuf was like, hey, we're giving back like 300 guys, and you're only giving back 100, so maybe some money as well to make it all fair, Gus? Say just 60,000. And Jefferson was like, fine. Okay, here's your money. But this was a ransom, not a tribute as had been previously demanded before. Still, for a time it meant that there was not going to be any more piracy. So the whole ransom thing may have gotten the prisoners returned, but it didn't really solve the problem. The peace lasted for only a couple of years. But this time it was Algeria that started to cause the issues. But that wouldn't be settled until after the War of 1812. The Second Barbary War was much shorter than the first, lasting just a few days in 1815. After the capture of the Algerian flagship and another vessel, the American Navy showed up on the shores of Algeria to just kind of demand that the 10 American prisoners being held would be handed over, and that this time it would be the pirates who would be paying up instead. In exchange, the Algerians would get their ships back, as well as the 500-some folks the U.S. had captured during the adventure. Also, the U.S. would no longer do any tribute payments, at all. Also, no more piracy, guys, seriously. Let our merchants operate without being hassled, got it? So, why am I telling you this story about pirates and wars and ransoms? Because it is a great example of 3 ways on how to deal with the hostage situation. Option 1. Give in and provide the hostage takers basically everything they want and that you can provide. 1/5 of the U.S. government spending, perhaps? That would be too nicely. Thank you very much. Option 2. Stand tough. Engage in a long drawn-out battle, get some concessions for a lower ransom, and then kind of give in. But no, we're not really giving in, guys. Honestly, we're just paying you some money to get our people back. And option 3. Go in strong, provide a show of force if necessary as a demonstration, and demand a peaceful ending of things, with those who engage in the hostage-taking having to pay a price in the end. And if that doesn't seem likely to work, be prepared and in a position to go all in on a rescue to try to save the hostages, and hope the hostage-takers understand that the consequences for them would be much worse if they failed to give in, and you had to go rescue those hostages. Now, I would be remiss by not mentioning that a lot of the circumstances over the decades I just talked about had things changed dramatically as far as the situation was in the United States and the Mediterranean. Europe was having a lot of death. The whole Napoleonic Wars, for instance, kept them from putting much resources in, just stopping the piracy problem down south. Or that the period of peace after the War of 1812, the defeat of Napoleon, that let the post-secondary Barbary War period see more organized anti-piracy efforts and even military action against Algeria by Europeans as well as others. That may have eventually led to all sorts of consequences and colonization of North Africa by European empires a couple decades later, which is also a whole other story. So there's a lot of dynamics I'm glossing over to build my historical analogy, so sorry about that, but that's what you gotta do sometimes. You can read up on a lot of the details yourself if you're so interested. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the history other than dates and names after all. A lot of cool stories of dramatic action and kind of sometimes humorous encounters. Also a lot of murder and death. Anyway, I wanted a historical example of a hostage situation that showcased these three main options. There's also the fourth, which is to just ignore the hostage takers entirely and hope for the best, but that's usually either because you're being irresponsible or busy fighting the British. And I wanted one not built in hypotheticals so that I could draw out the conclusions of the various choices as they happen in the real world, to demonstrate the evidence of how things generally worked out when you used one of these options. The first option, the give in and pay up option, didn't stop the piracy, at all. Not paying wouldn't have either, but they've just sold the captured people off to slavers and things like that, and made a much smaller profit that way, but they'd still get some money out of it. But as it happened though, the US paid a whole lot of money to rescue hundreds of people that if you were to take it out of the current federal budget deficit, percent-wise, would basically take out a chunk larger than the entire defense budget. Sorry, I can't pay for hundreds of thousands of troops or to buy tanks, planes, and battleships. We gotta pay for the ransoms of these bunch of sailors over here. And this seems like the best course of action, guys. For reals! So yeah, the first option was a little ridiculous. And ridiculous very much at the time, too. But the US was a smaller, newer country at the time, didn't exactly have the ability to project much in the way of power beyond the Boston Harbor. So they might not have had too many options, but, a few decades down the road, they did have the power to project overseas. Not effectively, but they could. And independent of the what-ifs of the situation, may or may not have been in position to end the First Barbary War by taking the third option, to let the long fight end with a sort of white peace option to get out of the situation, with a prisoner exchanges and some cash to make up the difference. Still a ransom, still kind of terrible, but not a budget buster of one. $60,000 is still a lot of money in early 1800s cash, but it's not $1 million. And maybe some disincentive to try that crap again was provided. Maybe. But even if it may have worked with Tripoli specifically, it didn't work with the next guy over who wanted some of that sweet cash. But option 3, and the fact that other nations basically took the same option at that point after the Second Barbary War, did bring an end to the hostage-taking in general, at least as far as Americans were concerned. So Izzy, why are you talking about all this? Because this example is, weirdly enough, a perfect example to use in parallel with some recent events. I know things move pretty fast in the hip of the kids these days, 21st century, but let me take you back to just the last few months, and specifically the government shutdown. Replace sailors with the paychecks of hundreds of thousands of government employees, and also likely millions more who work for companies that the government contracts out work to, and replace an unreasonable chunk of the US federal budget being demanded be turned over by kidnappers with also an unreasonable chunk of the US federal budget being turned over to kidnappers. Yeah, I'm calling the Trump administration kidnappers. What of it? I'm not going to forget what they did, and neither should you. Plus, they're also kidnapping actual kids. So if anything, I may be being a little too kind? Anywho, the whole shutdown thing really came down to the demands of the child-in-chief's want of a vanity Trump brand slat border wall. Independent of yours or my feelings about such absurdly useless construction projects that are basically monuments to performative racism, for the Democrats who had just won the day in November midterms, taking back the House of Representatives, it was basically a non-starter. Not only is the Democratic caucus basically united in how silly the wall is, but they've caught on to the fact that it is basically a demand for money that will only really benefit the president, not the American people. Kind of sounds like a hostage-taking situation, doesn't it? Just like back in the Barbary pirate days, the ransom money would only really help the pirates. The Wall, which I think Pink Floyd sang about at one point, is in essence a personal desire of the president and his core political supporters. These core supporters include his buddies like basically every Republican in the House and Senate, his own advisors, and those white boys with tiki torches. The Democrats see no real point to the Wall at all, other than making that collection of oh-so-friendly folks super happy, and they realize, holy crap, what they're getting out of it isn't a direct windfall to their bank accounts, except those invested in certain steel and construction companies, but a reward just as valuable to them, if not more so. This isn't a wall built out of good policy for the good of the nation. That's just the right-wing talking point, after all. It is a demand that the Democrats roll over and pay up a ransom so that the Republicans can demonstrate just how committed they are to hating brown people. So anyway, that's the ransom being demanded. And the hostages? Oh, just basically everyone who works for the federal government, including a good number of contractors who aren't normally counted among the 800,000 directly employed persons. From the guy who cleans the toilets at the federal office building, to the Department of Energy researcher, to the lady checking to make sure that meat passes inspection, to folks handling the back end of the court system. There's a lot of people in many different jobs that work for the government. I know, it's weird, right? Real people doing things. You never hear about this because, they do their job well. And until, and then you only hear about them when the government suddenly doesn't want to pay them anymore. It's almost like there's been a concerted effort to basically make them invisible and unappreciated for decades or something. So these innocent folks were taken hostage. They're just doing their job. The demands were then made and the stage set, even before the Democrats took control of the House. You see, the shutdown actually started before the new Congress critters were sworn in, when the Republicans still controlled the House. They just opted to not get that budget thing going anymore and punted it to the next Congress. Lazy bastards. Or really, they actually wanted Democrats to be involved. They wanted Democrats to get the blame for the actions of Republicans in either the budget badness here or the Wall. They wanted Democrats to be responsible for Republican actions. Again. I'll get more into that later. Thankfully, for even the most out-to-lunch pundits, the president decided that he would take the full blame for some reason on national TV. This is kind of me shrugging now. I know you can't see it, but it is what I'm doing. I guess Mr. Best Brain, or whatever he claims about himself this week, just doesn't have much political instincts, at least none on par with, say, Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, the evilest man in America. Anyway, so without the worry of the pundit class not seeing the obvious, thus making the option selection more difficult, the Democrats opted to take the third option when it came to hostage situations. They decided, screw you Republicans, you're going to give up the hostages, and we ain't giving you no ransom. They even managed to show force by temporarily making the president's State of the Union speech not really a thing. No, I didn't watch it. I don't got cable. Also, I don't hate myself that much. In the end, the government reopened, and despite a few hiccups, plus some plays of questionable legality by the president to get its vanity project going, things have been back to our current norm of depressingly low standards. Now, part of this option selection is likely due to a mix of things. The Democrat caucus in the House is much more progressive than it has basically been ever. Pelosi is not really a lady you mess with unless you want your ribs broken. The hostage situation was so obvious, it was so easy to make clear what it was to everyone that there was little risk of confusion by the public. And the Democrats had also learned the lessons of what happens when you take either of the two other options. So let us go back in time again to an era in politics that was much more naive, at least as far as elected officials were concerned. A time before the rise of hate crimes in the U.S. against basically everyone that doesn't do the goose step. A time before the Orange Man and the silly catchphrase was the focus of national ire. A time known as the distant past year of 2011. So the U.S. has this weird thing known as the debt ceiling. Basically, it's a limit in the law for how much the U.S. can have in total debt. At times, when that limit has been increased well ahead of any issues, as Congress would raise it when they figured their budget would cause more debt. But this time the Republican-controlled House under John Boehner had just kind of not let that happen. No increase in the debt limit when they approved of funding. They seemed super cool with letting the United States hit the debt ceiling. And part of the reason is, you see, whenever a Democrat controls any part of government, suddenly the national debt becomes the worst thing in the universe. And when Republicans control all branches of government, the worst thing in the universe is taxes. So when Dems are in control or partially in control, the call is to cut spending. And when the Republicans are in control, it's all about cutting taxes instead. And these universes act independently of each other as far as Republican demands go. Doesn't matter what the spending level is when you're in control, taxes must be cut. If you're not in control, then spending has to be cut. But anyway, I went into that aside to demonstrate the motivations for what happened. The Republicans saw this as a means to force a reduction in spending, right then and there. But having the US hit that limit and causing all sorts of panic, as suddenly the US was by law required to pay bills, but it was also now by law prevented from doing so, was a unworkable situation that every sane person was eager to avoid. Thus the Republicans thought they could get a law passed that would change the spending levels just like they wanted. And this would need to get the approval of President Obama, and some portion of the Democrats as they still controlled the Senate at the time. So the full faith and credit of the US was at stake, aka the hostage, and the ransom demanded was a budget cut, a massive one. We're talking Barbary pirate ransom money here, not chump change. In this instance, the Democrats took option 2. There was a long fight over various plans and compromises that eventually led to this weird thing called sequestration. That basically, unless they figured out a deal down the road, some big budget cuts that neither party really wanted would go into effect. If they did nothing, this would hit this would hit social programs, it would hit the defense budget, it would hit all the things. The Democrats thought, hey, this is a horrible thing, but maybe it's a good deal? I mean, debt has been a little high, I guess, recently, but with the whole economic collapse business last year, the Bush administration, the Bush bailouts of the banks, and the post-Bush stimulus plan that actually started to fix the economy. So maybe the Republicans have a point? Maybe, but nah, they'll never let the defense budget get cut, so we can save some of our favorite things in exchange for ending this sequestration business before the deadline. This is going to be a great plan, guys. And guess what? It didn't happen. They had kind of given in and were giving the Republicans everything they wanted, which was just general government cuts, surprise, even to defense, surprise, surprise. As I said, when Democrats control any lever of power, the Republicans become obsessed with deficit reduction. The why of it is maybe a topic for another video, but it is and was then a primary desire, a personal, self-enriching desire of the Republican Party. And despite the fight, and maybe not getting as big a cut as they wanted, or of what they wanted to cut specifically, they still got their big cut. That was good enough to count as a win in their book. So there was a fight, but the Democrats and the American people were still paying a ransom in the end, just a smaller one than was originally asked for. And just like the conclusion of the first Barbary War, it led to another confrontation. A new instigator, Trump in this case, not Boehner and the House Extremist Caucus of the year 2011, but still the same general dynamic. So the Dems had to learn maybe giving up via some weird compromise plan was a terrible idea. But even the terrible compromise that is sequestration was still a bit better than a previous hostage crisis. The hostage crisis that I like to call the 1990s, at least as far as politics goes, where you had a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, basically giving into a bunch of demands by the Republicans in the hope to cast himself as a moderate. To a degree, it worked. Bill Clinton, and only Bill Clinton, was seen by a number of folks as this old-fashioned Democrat, not one of those newfangled liberal democrats that Russia's always going on about, by a number of people across the country. After all, Clinton signed off on a bunch of horrific and generally bad laws like the Defense of Marriage Act, welfare reform, a bunch of deregulation that likely helped set the stage for the 2008 financial crisis, among other things. Of course, the Republicans rewarded Clinton for his capitulation by impeaching him. Yep, after a whole lot of giving in and the most absurd and awful Republican wants that hurt people for many years to come, they decided, oh, this guy who's basically doing everything we kind of want him to, he needs to suffer for is basically agreeing with us. And so the beatings continued. It has taken a while for Democrats to realize, oh, this was a terrible plan. And by Democrats, I do mostly mean the elected officials and pundit class. A good many of us were already disgusted back then by this giving in to the Republicans on something as a reflexive answer to any attack they launched. We already knew that it was a bad idea to take the first option in the hostage-taking situation. We already knew that, more had to be done. And yes, we also groaned when the option 2 was taken in 2011, because it was ridiculous and clearly not going to work, and serve the purposes of nobody other than the Republicans. Some may argue that it was a no-win situation to refuse to give up something. To that I say bullshit. I'm running short on time, so I won't go into my various what-if plans to avoid any such nonsense, but though I do love my hypotheticals. Anyway, so clearly, taking option 2 didn't work in 2011, as sequestration still happened because Republicans just couldn't come to any sort of agreement to avoid it. Like, seriously, guys, we tried, man. Ho-ho! Which was kind of an obvious tactic for them to use. And then, of course, they could blame the Democrats for just being so unreasonable, guys. That's surely why this broke down and we didn't come to a plan to avoid these massive budget cuts. But this year, Pelosi was like, screw that noise. I have mixed feelings about her, as far as her politics goes, but I will still give her credit when it's due. When Republicans under Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump shut down the government for weeks on end, it was they who ended up blinking. Trump opted to try to save face with his nonsensical emergency declaration, and that's still being wrangled over. But the Democrats in the House had decided that they would no longer be complicit in the schemes of hostage takers. And hopefully this is the beginning of the end of hostage-taking in general. I can hope. Because the right answer isn't simply to give in or to have a scuffle and then give some of what was wanted as a means to just declare victory and just kind of stop fighting. No, this kind of behavior must be confronted and capitulation must be refused. Otherwise, hostage-takers like Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump will continue to take hostages. But if it doesn't actually get them anything, they will try different, less dangerous and destructive tactics. Tactics that hopefully won't put the lives of millions in jeopardy. Yes, I consider someone having their paycheck zeroed out for weeks on end having their life put in danger. Because they can't, buy food, they might lose their home, they need, they got maybe life-saving medicines they need to, provide for themselves or their family. Not getting paid when you were expecting to can be disastrous and put your life at risk. So McConnell, Trump, and the Republicans in Congress did put millions of people's lives in danger. Plus, having meat inspectors able to do their job is kind of useful for not having people get sick. Did I mention a few weeks back I got some nasty food poisoning? That kind of delayed me getting this video put together. Government shutdown. Inspection rates drop, meat arrives at the store, I buy the meat, I eat the meat, I get horribly sick. I'm sure it's just a coincidence. Surely. So, what is the purpose of this series? Grand Strategy of Politics is a series of videos where I talk about the strategies involved in politics. Yes, I have a particular bent as far as my politics go, and so to a degree these videos are to help those of a similar bent realize some of how the game is played. To provide you fine folks, a means to better understand the habits and nuances of the situations that we see in our day-to-day lives as well as the national stage, so that you may be able to see and act as a more responsible political actor and also see who else is being a responsible political actor and who is maybe being a little bit more self-serving. For each strategy selection comes from a want. Yes, not every politician is smart enough to choose the best course of action for what they want to do, because not everyone realizes the validity of their options or that they even exist. But they will attempt to choose the course of action that will get them what they want, given what they know and what they think is effective. My example here of pirates and Republicans is all about that. Republicans want a collection of policy goals and don't much care that they also hurt people to get them. Democrats generally would rather not hurt the American people. Republicans know this and thus are super okay with using the want of the Democrats against them to get some of the Republican policies put into place. And so I gave several examples of instances where Republicans, in seeking their want, pushed the Democrats to have to react, and then showed how the behavior of the Democrats changed over time as they came to better understand the tactics being used by Republicans. As they learned that what they were doing before just wasn't working, and so maybe there's more, those seemingly more risky options started to not seem so dangerous. They maybe started making sense. And so the recent hostage crisis perhaps even showed them that perhaps this is the way forward, to not capitulate so easily, guys. To, not give in and force the Republicans to back down instead. At least, I hope that's the lesson they took from it. All the same, as I go forward with the series, I want to explore a number of different situations, some of them very much current events, others a little more historical perhaps, where the strange behaviors of politics and politicians in it is perhaps not well understood by the general public. I'll also be doing some talk on how you, as a voter, can be better prepared to be a political actor yourself, even if voting is all you do. So thank you for joining me. I'll aim to have a standard sign-off figured out at some point, somewhere around here. But for the moment, I'll just kind of end it with this. If you want me to help you and others out on this sort of thing, please help me do so by hitting that like button and doing all that subscribe business. Also, I've got a Patreon going if you want to support me directly, link down below. I got a small channel, and so any assistance you can give will do wonders to help my channel and others of similar bent get more notice, and maybe one day supplant the awful dreck we see constantly all over YouTube. And until next time, everybody, toodles!